Okay, hope everybody enjoyed their lunch. And so far we've had a pretty good talk. We've heard some wonderful talks from Patricia and Dave. So today we're going to be starting our keynote panel discussion. So I will very briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'll briefly go through the sort of format that we're going to go through, and then we'll get to the questions and all the fun stuff, right? And the idea is that hopefully we'll have 10 minutes left over for audience Q&A. So part of our panel today, we have, starting over here, we have Patricia Marino, as you've all met before, hopefully. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of Waterloo. We also have Rob Cerjanec here. He's the member of provincial parliament for Ajax. And we also have Dr. Ian MacDonald, who is a philosopher from the University of Waterloo. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple rounds of different questions. We're going to start with a round where I'm going to put a question to each panelist, and they're going to have a few minutes to respond. And then eventually we're going to do another round of questions where there'll be some more open conversation. And just so everyone knows, the questions were submitted by members of the Ethics of AI Society. So, okay, so first question is as follows. More and more companies are seeking to develop AI models that support decision-making by making public authorities like medical diagnoses and safety site inspection locations. Should government agencies be allowed to use AI models that are proprietary and opaque, and or should public sector AI require full explainability? So maybe we'll start with Patricia for 2 minutes, and then Rob, and then here.
Okay, great. So when I'm thinking about this question, the first thing that comes to my mind is my former PhD student. Some of my work's in ethics, and my former student now works as a clinical ethicist at a big hospital. And one of her current jobs is to help guide the hospital on using AI systems. And one of the things I learned from her that I found very interesting was that the question of when an AI system would be adopted in a hospital is kind of like the systems in which things come into the hospital is both in ethics and in procurement. So there used to be this sort of two ways that a hospital system would decide, which things to purchase. And so one of the things she's been spearheading is how can we get a coherent kind of AI guidance policy that would help make those choices work better. To me, when I'm thinking about these questions, a lot depends on the use. I think different uses are very, very different. I know there's been a lot of concerns about diagnostics and explainability. And that one reason for that is that it's hard to say why you would make a certain recommendation if you don't have an explainable reason for why an AI system made a certain prediction. But to me, that's always seemed a little, I'm not totally convinced about that line of argument, because I always thought, well, a physician could also tell you, I think this is going to be cancerous, or I think based on my viewing of this tumor, I think that I would classify it this way. And to me, that's a case where the predictability is important, and having a human in the loop might be important. But that seems to me maybe less of an area where you need explainability. But then in other contexts, like the kind of things I was talking about this morning, where you're talking about, who to give a low, who to hire, those tend to be different kinds of cases where I think explainability becomes much more important. Because if you have a system that is producing sort of replicating the inequities that exist in a society, then I think you have a big problem. And the explainability, I think, is a big part of that.
Rob?
So many different use cases here. I think from a use in a government application, in some ways there's a higher threshold, right? Because government, at the end of the day, is accountable to the public, to people. So to be able to explain the reasons why a decision was made, to me, makes a lot of sense. Because you want to avoid, for example, the criminal justice system, for example, decisions that are made through an AI system, maybe it's filtering through cases, helping prosecutors that may either go down a case of, wrongfully accused, like that's a big concern, and it's happened before, not through AI, but in real life many years ago. So you want to be very, very careful with these kinds of things. I think AI can play a very big tool to help us, for example, save money, to help us make some of these better decisions, but it needs to be explainable. It's almost like, when you go to the gas station, the pumps need to be checked and calibrated, every couple of years. Should we be doing that with systems? What are we requiring in terms of what we're procuring? And the procurement piece that you mentioned is quite big because it takes a lot of time to do government procurement. When you're in a hospital, anything public, there's a lot of steps. So building some of that into the front end, I think makes a lot of sense. Because if it is opaque and we don't know the reasons why, I think the risk to public and the risk to trust in government and its institutions would be shaken. Ian?
Very good. I don't think it's optional. I think it is required, especially when we consider explainability. I'm a little concerned about saying fully explainable, of course, because we're dealing with sort of whose neural nets, and again, there's an house of many concerns, and we don't fully understand how they work. I agree with both of you, actually, about the need for a human in the loop. I would even go a bit more specifically. That human should be of that relevant domain where the AI is being applied, right? So a physician should in that loop when it comes to cancer detection or detecting tumors. Now, what is going to happen, as I see it, and I think this is happening now with AI, is that despite it not being fully explainable, we still need people to be responsible, right? When it comes to delegating these responsibilities. Often what's happening too is there's a fragmentation of responsibility, right? AI makes responsibility fragmented, diffuse, right? So you start wondering, okay, when something goes wrong, right? Who is going to be in charge of that? Who's going to take accountability? Will it be the programmer, right? And you say, well, wait a second, is it the programmer? Is it the regulator? Is it the deploying agent, right? And in these cases, I think actually the deploying agent is going to play a particular role. It's kind of analogous to, say, a pilot who's using autopilot, right? If that autopilot leads to crashing into a building, we still blame the pilot, right? And say, no, you can't just say this is automated, right? You can't say we're just going on autopilot and you have no responsibility there. So I would want to put that spotlight on responsibility as well and say that, especially in the public sector, this explainability is required, but also to pair that with responsibility or answerability.
So we are going to go to our second question. So the question is, if governments, I think this is very much in line with what we were talking about this morning, right? If governments are developing long-term AI strategies, what kinds of voices need to be at the table to make those strategies ethically legitimate, if such a thing can be?
We'll start the other at this time.
Okay, start with Ian.
Wow. I think we have to have a pluralistic approach about this. I mean, the tentacles of AI have spanned across all sorts of regions, right? I'd be concerned about those who are marginalized, those who have been, subjected to bias and discrimination. Also, frontline workers. I think they have to have a say when it comes to the deployment of AI. Again, we don't want this to be, simply automated. That to me is a real concern. But I'm going to say a few things that might surprise you. I'm going to say that philosophers need to play a role here, especially in thinking about, I know that sounds like, I'm just shamelessly selfish.
Trying to keep his job.
But let me make the argument for it. Yes, thank you. Is that we're not just thinking short term, we're thinking long term. Scientists are going to play a role too. I mean, think about climate change, right? And people kind of hyperbolically discounting things and saying, well, the climate's not a big issue and it's a lovely day today, and being like, how naive, right? If we're just going to sort of invest in the short term, especially with AI where it makes things efficient and expedient, then there's a real worry. I also think, and this might surprise you, that AI should have a voice in this. I think that, artificial intelligence itself is leading to all these advances, and I really see it as exposing human bias and our shortcomings or limitations in many ways. I think this is one of the really, the space for optimism when it comes to that. So those are probably two voices that I think are not often discussed in this context, but I think they need to be there.
Rob? So we're in a really interesting, I think, phase right now, because yes, AI has existed for many, many years, but it hasn't really been used, whether government, public, any of this, in the way in which it is until now. So I mean, the simple answer, and I would agree, I think you need to have everyone around the table, but we also need government to be nimble and quick. And the reason why I bring that up is let's talk about an education system. Let's talk about K-12 education. There is no formal guidance whatsoever from the provincial government around not just the use of AI in the classroom of students or in teachers, but helping people understand right now with these language learning models, how they work, how to use it effectively or not. Because there's some people that will just put blind trust into it and think what's going to come out is going to be accurate, and it's not. So we need government to be nimble around these areas. That probably will mean updated guidance every year or so. That means training for teachers as well in order to be able to do that. Because if we don't think about how it's impacting us right now and make some of those adjustments and changes right now, I think we're setting people up to fail. I was meeting with some high school teachers a couple days ago, and there was a big push towards doing online courses and now doing these exams using AI. Students are using it. Meanwhile, if they're doing it in person, they're getting like a 58, but they're using the AI, they're getting 98%, right? And the kids can't explain their work or show their work. So we're in this, it's an interesting kind of area. I know it's not directly the question of who else needs to be around there. But it's also, yeah, folks like labor. We need everyone around that table, but then we need to make, I would say, good decisions, but we have to do that quickly. Because there's also a huge opportunity to grow our economy. There's a huge opportunity to create new businesses and new opportunities and save government money, but it's how do you manage that transition? So I think you need everybody around the table to do that.
Awesome. I really liked both of your answers, and I really liked what Ian was saying about frontline workers, because I think like one of the things that I feel like I've learned is that different domains introduce different kinds of complexities, and you don't necessarily know what those are until you talk to people who are like doing a thing and using it and running what kind of obstacles they're running into. And I especially connected that to what you were saying about teachers, because I think like teachers they have that firsthand experience of like what students are learning and what they're not learning and what things are working, which things are not working. So I would definitely reinforce that. I'd also just like to speak on behalf of the metaphor of the table. So some of my work is about decision processes that try to edge toward more quantitative decision processes like cost benefit analysis, things like that. And I, being well acquainted with all decision methods have challenges, but being well acquainted with the challenges of that, I'm very in favor of or very attuned to the benefits that you get when you learn things from a range of people. And so I just also like to reinforce that it's very important to think in terms of decisions that get based on a collaborative, deliberative methodology, as well as a cost-benefit analysis methodology.
Matt, just if I may, just on this, because I had introduced a bill in the legislature for the province to create a strategy around AI that would deal with talent, people leaving Ontario, coming back, how do we do that? How do we create more businesses? But also just how do we come up with a strategy? And it's not an exhaustive list, but we came up with folks that are involved in the sector right now, making money essentially off of it. Safety organizations as well, civil liberties groups, disability rights groups, the healthcare sector, Indigenous groups, industry, so that's manufacturing, agriculture, energy, etc. Information privacy regulators, because that's another big aspect of this. Labor, students, so all of those, and there's more. I think philosophers, maybe we can put in that list as well. But we need to have everyone around the table at least to help give input into that strategy. Otherwise, I think in this very new space, government isn't going to make the right decisions. But we also have to be nimble and quick to do it.
So we're a little bit short on time, so we're going to move on to the moderated discussion portion of this. So I've put the question to the panel, and anyone can kind of sort of chime in one at a time. So we'll start with the first question. So in light of the Tumbler Ridge shooting, should generative AI companies have a legal duty to report credible threats to authorities? If so, what criteria should define the threshold for reporting potentially violent and dangerous AI interactions to law enforcement?
I don't mind starting. I think maybe no. I understand the temptation for that, and I understand the benefits that could come from that, but I'm also very leery of the tech companies being in a position where they are the decision makers about things like credibility. And only was a push, when people were talking about social media and, false falsities being shared on social media, a push to have the social media companies play a bigger role in labeling. And I've always been nervous about that, as they don't, as a philosopher, I know that distinguishing truth and falsity is not always straightforward. And I am leery to think that the tech companies whose leadership I don't always trust would be put in a position of the decision maker on something that's sensitive.
This is really hard, because what do you determine as a credible threat, right? Number one, it could be something like, okay, a specific target, a concrete plan, credible means, and some sort of proximity to it. Maybe that's more of a credible threat. So it gets into this really, you almost could get into like the Big Brother situation, right? Where depending on what you say or do or put in, is your individual freedom at risk as well, right? So it's a really tough area to do it. Or if you're using AI, let's say, to plan something, so is the company then responsible? Like, are they an accomplice to it? That's the other piece, right? So how do we figure that out? This is a really hard one. I think there probably does need to be some sort of a balance, but it's always going to be after the fact. Well, how come you knocked on that person's door and broke it down, right? Like, that's one example. But then it also could be, well, why didn't you inform it, which was the Tumbler wrench situation. So there needs to be some sort of framework in there. I think we need to err on the side of almost caution to individuals. But it's a tough one. This is a hard one.
So let's see this case as being potentially precedent setting. And one of the things that I want to go to is that there's already precedent here for some of those. So if you're familiar with the Tarasov duty, right? It's a duty to warn with therapists, for instance, if they have a patient who says, I am going to kill this person and I'm going to do it in these ways, and very specific, right? They have a duty to break their confidentiality, right? A duty to warn. It's a legal duty, by the way. In some states in the United States, I think the case originated in California where this woman, Tarasov, was murdered, right? And then they said, well, therapists are going to have to disclose this. Confidentiality has its limits. I do worry, Patricia, for the specific reasons you say about these AI companies doing that, because I can imagine them saying, oh, we're just going to automate it. We're just going to have AI be the watchdog of AI, right? Which I think you might need a therapist in the loop, or an educator in the loop, or someone who can identify these threats. I'm also worried that, when it comes to these detection mechanisms, it could just be keywords or something like this. When I look up ISIS, I should caution myself. When I look up ISIS and I look up the Egyptian goddess, because I'm interested in Egyptian mythology, if I'm on a watch list because of that, I'm very concerned. I happen to have philosophers, who again can be a bit misanthropic. I hate people. Am I going to now, alert with a duty to warn others? And is the AI system going to flag them because they're, caught in their sullen Schopenhauer frame of mind, right? The vanity of existence, and what are we but impresaria swimming in a droplet of swamp water? Okay, right. I'm channeling Schopenhauer. So I worry about that because maybe I'm writing a novel, and then all of a sudden I have this grisly scene where someone's plotting a murder, and now I'm flagged, right? So I do worry about this, but I think there is a precedent here about a legal duty to warn, and that's as far as I'm a bit out of my realm here with law. But if someone is a legal scholar, they can maybe help me. But I have those thoughts to contribute to this.
So it's interesting because, again, this is a bit of a follow-up, I guess. So given what we were talking about earlier, right, there's always that risk of false positives and false negatives. You flag somebody that you shouldn't, or you don't flag somebody that you should. Mm-hmm. And if we don't trust the tech companies to make these decisions on their own, and we want to push towards things like regulation, is there a concern, do you think, that people might have in terms of getting the public to understand the idea of false positives and false negatives, and getting them to understand that there may not necessarily be a kind of perfect balance that's going to solve all kinds of cases? Do we see this as being a potential challenge for regulating these kinds of things?
100%.
And if so, how do we get the public to better understand what they want to regulate?
I think we get, as a MPP, when I knock on doors in my community, you know what I hear the most? Property taxes. You know what the biggest driver of our property taxes are? Policing costs. So then who also pays? So that's the other part of this conversation. So who is responsible for doing that legwork? Because I can tell you that it's just shifted onto enforcement authorities like the police. It's not going to work, quite frankly, because they are overburdened already as it is. So that's the other angle I think I want to add to this.
And it's funny because again, it feeds very much similarly into the issue of like trying to predict recidivism, right? Like, is someone just going to be a danger, right? And how do you, if we have to sort of automate that kind of process, how do you build that in a way that's going to be sort of ethically appropriate?
Well, that becomes a massive concern, especially with the opacity considerations of these advanced systems. And, unfortunately, oftentimes a lot of those people who are in this, who's in the system, don't have a lot of money, and they're poor, and then they don't have the sort of attorneys that they need to actually, help them with these cases. Not only that, I mean, it's very scary with a lot of these systems that would then flag you and say you're high risk, right? And we're not going to grant you parole because of certain criteria. And then they tell you we're not going to tell you what those criteria are because it's under trade secrets, right? And you should have the right to see the evidence before you, right? Especially if you're charged with something. And to deny that right, I think, not only as, again, someone who's philosophically minded and cares about evidence and making sure to believe in proportion to evidence and an evidentialist approach, but that just seems, unjustifiable, unjust.
So we'll maybe move on to our next question. So AI is ready and will continue to, AI has already and will continue to dramatically change the skills required for knowledge work, like software developers, accountants, researchers, lawyers, and so on. These types of jobs typically require a degree where students develop sufficient knowledge and a set of skills to be successful. As AI increasingly demonstrates its capabilities in capturing knowledge, whatever that means, connecting ideas and applying skills like coding and accountancy, what is the value of post-secondary education for young people looking to pursue these types of careers? How should colleges and universities adapt their curriculum, program structures, and assessments to prepare students for the future of work?
So the future of work has always been changing. Right, if you think back to 50 years ago, there used to be typing tools. We don't have typing tools anymore, right? The way we process data, it has changed. I saw something online yesterday for like 5 megabytes of data. It was like something, from that wall to here in a big box. Now you can have 6 terabytes of data on something the size of your phone, right? So things are always going to change. I think what it will require, AI is going to require us to do is to be greater experts in our field. To be able to understand the reason, understand the things behind it, to then interpret it and make better decisions. So I think that's where we're going with that, but it is going to totally change the nature of work. But it's not something new, and I don't think we can pretend that it's something new.
So I agree with what I take to be a kind of mainstream view that some of the things AI is good at force us to become more human in our critical thinking and to learn the skills that we need to learn to use AI intelligently and hopefully offload the lower stakes, more drudgery kind of work onto more automated systems. And we had some interesting talk this morning about education and about like what kind of obviously we talked a lot at the university about what kind of assessments we're giving, and there's been as we all have experienced, a push toward more in-person assessments to really determine what students can do when they're not sitting in front of a computer, which in some ways has been great. The one thing I'm hoping we can kind of leave open space for in this conversation is the importance of the middle. Because I feel like with this way of automating is pushing us a little bit in the direction of more inequality, where a really high quality education is going to be a lot of in-person assessments. We're told, a really great assessment would be like a one-on-one oral, exam conversation, right? Some of those things are wonderful, but very resource intensive. We're lucky in philosophy that aren't lucky, that often our classes are small enough to do things like that. I say lucky in quotes, right? The flip side of not having enough students. But I worry that the sort of one, without pushback, one effect of this could be a sort of two-track thing where you have people who are getting these very high quality educations where they're doing a lot of in-person learning and, having in-person assessments, and then you're having another track, right, where people are doing a lot of AI-enabled assessments and even getting evaluated by AI. And so I just hope we can maintain that there's also room for the pretty good education, right? That the resources are there for people to get a decent education as well.
I worry about sort of technology narrowing their vision to, and a lot of students are trying to sort of master this technology, right, and go into tech fields, and that's important, granted. I'm going to concede that. Again, I'm going to play my jam if you don't mind. It's going to be a bit tiring. I'm not going to say philosophy, but I'll say, the value of the liberal arts, for example, and, these things that aren't exactly quantifiable, which certainly technology is affecting these. But with many of my students, I find even going back before, a lot of these chatbots have come, and the advent of that, a lot of these students wanted to pursue things that, their parents said, oh, you can't do this, right? You've got to be a financier, a CEO. And I would have students come to me and say, but I want to write poetry, right? And, their existential hour will come and they'll want to do that. And, I think with technology and AI, it's really sort of funneling these interests in a kind of narrow way that worries me. And, sort of, it actually goes to a point that you made, Nick, with the sort of labor and the labor that's being forced on some students too, maybe even to do more things with this technology that we have. And there's already, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of operational shadow work. Operational shadow work is where you've encountered an example of this, where you're in the grocery store and you need to check out your own items, right? The shadow work is now the work that you and I have to do. This leads to burnout. It leads to resentment. It leads to a kind of fractured society that I worry about. And AI seems to accelerate that in certain ways. Now, it does allow us to automate some of these tasks, which I think are really important. I actually see in science, for example, the replication crisis, the really boring, tedious work where you confirm results, as being something that AI systems could really help with. And, for students then that can do these kind of bolder ideas and the Nobel Prizes for medicine and something. But I want them to have the sort of, moral courage to do what they want to do.
We have a bit more time now.
It's a bit large.
No, that's okay. It's a philosophy subject. So I'm slightly curious, just following up on this idea that education and what universities should be doing in terms of changing, and this I think was again what I think was talking about earlier, right? Is do we need to rethink assessments? Do we need to rethink grades? We're talking about this issue of grade inflation and all these students who are competing with each other, to the point where we're willing to sort of say, well, here's your grades, and take them in good health, right? But what, if it's no longer a useful metric or no longer a useful way to do this, is there a way that the universities and colleges and even high schools can sort of rethink how we assess skill and success?
It's interesting. It's very interesting. I think just from an assessment standpoint, you almost need to now, and this is where I think we need to be a bit more nimble, is using AI to complete assignments and be graded on that. But then as well, be able to do that, whether it's verbally, whether that's pen and paper. I actually think, especially in high school, we're going to need to go back to pen and paper or pencil and paper for some of these types of assessments. Otherwise, people aren't going to be able to show their work and be able to prove it. And then we're going to be graduating people that are pretty much incapable of functioning in a normal society. Like, that's my concern. And I'm seeing folks graduating grade 12 that can't read or write or add or subtract properly. We've got some problems. And if we don't fix that, I don't know what that's going to mean for our society 20 years down the road.
Sure, go ahead, please, Donna.
I'll pick up on it because I totally agree about the importance of both being able to have the assignments where the AI is used and have the assignments where you're by yourself with a pencil, a piece of paper. I think those are really different skills. And I think it actually is worth having assignments and assessments that try to have people showcase those skills separately.
And can I, again, just as a quick follow-up, so again, is there room for AI to make a difference there, right? Because again, the gold standard might be, just talking to somebody and saying, well, here's what I've done, here's how I understand this issue. They ask you questions, you respond. That's literally the kind of thing you could get a chatbot to do,
Good.
right? And keep track of how the student responds, right? So should that be more focused?
So you could. Right, and when we talk about chatbots, of course, we want students to craft really careful questions, and maybe this is part of it, right? And as an inquirer, I think that's extremely important. Now, you're going to have students who are going to use the chatbots to craft the questions too, right? This inevitably happens, but I wish some of this could be rooted in trust too, right? And I know that's one of these very tenuous concepts, but I'm not going to say if I gave you a ring and you could turn yourself invisible, what would you do? And would you have the sort of fortitude not to cheat and steal and so on? But we're kind of at that crux, right? Technologically, where it's kind of like a ring of Gyges. The students that I teach sometimes think this is Lord of the Rings. It's not. It's coming from Plato, and it's about seeing whether one has the character that you would need to be this just. Being the best citizen. Maybe that's dawns on me, the sort of consideration about citizenry. But, crafting those questions is something that a chatbot can help you do through a kind of dialogue, right? It's not always the best, and we often should note those limitations of it. But I see a kind of hybrid approach in many of these things, and I'm not against AI here. So I actually see it as kind of sharpening our chops, but we need to build up those habits, those scholarly habits to begin with. And if the students don't have those, it could be trouble when you give them the ring of invisibility, right?
So we'll move on to our final question. So given the very finite resources that we have and the ethical trade-offs that we must make about resources and funding, for example, but not limited to issues relating to mental health and the use of chatbots as therapists, what red lines should exist where we should say that AI should just not be used for certain kinds of tasks? Premier, maybe?
Not yet. I think it's hard because I look at a couple examples here. Like mental health, I think is something where there's nuance to. Right, and you need at least a human in some situations to be able to help determine that. But I'll give you an example: search and rescue. Probably use AI quite a bit to really narrow down where somebody might be or the scope. Police services now are using drones. Now, they're human-operated drones right now, but there's assistive features as part of those drones. There's also flight paths that need to be created. There's a really neat company based here in Waterloo that has a AI-based flight path system to ensure compliance with NAV Canada requirements, so it doesn't, hit a plane or something else, right? So I think it really depends. I think if we're dealing with humans and life and individuals and liberty, I think there needs to be some sort of a human check on that. You're dealing with other things that can be a lot more efficient, but I wouldn't trust a search and rescue operation to be fully AI driven, right?
I think the red lines is tricky here, because I think if you'd asked me that 3 years ago, I probably would have said something like therapy, one-on-one therapy is a kind of red line, but I'm kind of amazed, how many young people are getting a lot of comfort from the sort of anonymity and what I hear is that teenagers have some kind of comfort in being able to have these kinds of engagements with these chatbots that no one else is like, needs to be in on it. It feels impersonal to them and gives them a sense of comfort and security. So that made me rethink my position and say that I don't know how that will turn out. And so that makes me think maybe the red line metaphor is maybe it's more like we need to see how some of these things are going to go before we're really confident in making those judgments.
I feel this terrible tug of war in me too. I'm very ambivalent about this, right? On the one hand, in maybe a triage situation where someone's having suicidal ideation or something, that they need this immediate intervention. But I wonder over the long term what this is doing. Does it give us a kind of pseudo comfort, right? Especially if someone's died and you need to experience the absence of that to fully kind of understand that loss, right? And I wonder if, because oftentimes with some of these chatbots, they'll take on the persona of a deceased relative or friend or this sort of thing, and then I have real concerns whether that's the same thing, right? But I'm not suggesting you said that. But when it comes to these feelings, right, these immediate feelings, if it's going to stop someone from doing self-harm, then I certainly want that, right? Like this is the gravity of the situation, the urgency of it is there. But I just wonder in the sort of long term, how this is affecting our feelings. These, especially when it comes to chatbots, they don't have desires and feelings like you and I do, right? It can make me a promise and say, Ian, I promise never to say that again. But I don't think it can solemnly meet the sincerity condition of a promise, right? It doesn't have the kind of trust that I could place in you or you could place in I. So I worry about this. It doesn't care about truth as you and I will get into later, right? The same way you do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to the student the other day about therapy, and again, when you think about the people who are high risk, people going to therapy, there's a lot of drop off. And again, because of things like anonymity, it actually is a bit easier to kind of stick with it. And you can continue to collect more data on those types of people that you may not have access to that data otherwise. So to some extent, you can actually learn a little bit more about people that you would have otherwise known because they're willing to sort of stick with the process a bit longer. Are there any other sort of examples that you could think of where you could say, well, read one AI or something like that?
I go back life and liberty. Right? Like somebody's freedom and somebody's life at the end of the day. I think that is probably for me to recommend where there needs to be a human element to it. Otherwise, the risks are very big.
I'm wondering if perhaps you could maybe give us some insight into what kinds of government type work you might think, particularly, I mean in terms of lawmaking. So, for example, drafting bills and things like that. Is that something that AI should be used for, shouldn't be used for?
I've used AI to try to have it introduce the bill. The thing when you do bills in the legislature, so there's a legal check to it, right? So you can use AI is quite pervasive in the legal work, right? And I think there's still that end piece that you've got to get a greater expert in your field to do it. But I can draft a private member's bill. It's not on the opposition side, I'm on the government side. So there's a lawyer assigned to assist us with those. But I can say, hey, I want this and do it this format, give it to them, and then they'll go through it, right? And ensure that it meets those requirements. It just makes it easier.
What about when it comes to things like legal disputes? So at our last symposium, we were talking to Mark Grossman, who's a lawyer, and she was talking about her experience with a dispute on eBay, right? And it was like a small thing, very small, $5 kind of purchase, right? And one of the earrings didn't come. And she was talking about the dispute process, and this was all sort of handled algorithmically. But she said, well, it was fair. It came to a fair outcome, and I got a result fairly quickly. Again, there are limitations in what government can do and resources and what the legal system's capable of. So, would there be some kinds of occasions where you might say, well, maybe AI would be okay in those kinds of circumstances?
I think in that's more of a mediation type process, and that it still requires the parties to agree. Let's say if we look at more form like family law, like for example, somebody's getting a divorce, issues of child support, custody, or stuff like that. If you can get both parties to agree, but the reality in some of these situations there is there's emotions, that are attached to that, that in some ways cloud our judgment and our thinking.
I worry about these chatbot hallucinations, confabulations, giving people the wrong legal advice in really critical cases. I mean, I'm not sure if you know the humorous examples of this, even when it comes to sort of quotidian matters like making cheese on pizza stick. Well, the chatbot actually suggested you use Elmer's glue. Use some Elmer's glue to make your cheese on the. And I don't think glue and cheese. Well, not all cheeses, right? There's some cheeses that are inferior, but you know, these sort of things, or that you should have a diet that has at least one pebble or rock a day because it will give you some essential minerals that you need. Right? These were coming from like spoof sites, like The Onion and things like that. But again, the chatbots are not able to pick up that this is a spoof site. They take it literally, and then they give out this kind of advice. When it comes to law, I'm kind of, you know, an infant in the soul and this sort of thing. So I would just trust it maybe unwittingly, and that would be naive. So I'd worry in those sort of cases.
So you raised a good point in terms of healthcare, because maybe we'll talk much about
The burning poisoning.
But let me perhaps again slightly flip the question, I suppose. Would there be some cases in healthcare where you'd say, you know, beyond just sort of normal, I guess, sort of like diagnostics, like radiology and stuff like that? Like, are there occasions where we would say, yeah, you know, having a medical chatbot that you could talk to if you don't have to go to a doctor?
I use it for my high blood pressure, right, to keep that down. And you know, can I take sodium out of this? And what do I need? What are the key factors here, especially when it's food or lifestyle? But again, I want to be careful. I want to have probably a nutritionist in the loop or a physician, right? And make sure we have those checks and balances. So,
What do they say? Don't go to the internet if you've got a health problem. Go to a doctor. I mean, well, I don't know. Maybe in 5 years with you, you're better off. I think maybe.
And your doctor goes to the interview.
Well, I mean, I actually a friend of mine earlier last week had to go to the doctor and then needed a note, and then the doctor used ChatGPT to write the letter.
right.
Oh yeah, actually, right. So I'm actually a little concerned about some of those pieces too. Maybe it's just how we have to look at our healthcare system. But you can use AI. So for example, right, people are getting imaging, and it could be for cancer, it could be for something else, and there are AI software that exists now, and that probably can have a greater prevalence in almost like double checking or flagging just in case. That's probably a really good thing. Right, to be certain, because like accessing healthcare is scary sometimes. It's scary because you don't know, am I going to live? You know, what's going to happen? So to have some of that, actually, I think probably is a good thing if the goal is people living longer, healthier lives, or quality of life.
Okay. So we're, I think, well in time for what we have planned, but we have some time left over for Q&A from the audience. Does anybody have any questions for the panel?
Yes, I know this is a very subjective question, but from your personal experiences, what do you think is the human propensity for using AI to enrich critical thinking versus the opposite, where people essentially outsource their thinking?
Good question. I mean, I think, to be honest, I've looked at it more on how to do certain tasks quicker and better. So my background before used to be in communications. Right, so that could be writing a press release. It could be actually taking multiple different reports and then getting Google Notebook LM to say, okay, take the big points in this. Okay, great. Now let's summarize it. Okay, now turn it. So I mean, in some ways, make it easier and simpler from a critical thinking perspective. I'll be honest, myself, I haven't had to use it in that way that much in the end.
I think it might have to do as much with your motivation as with the thing you're using and the tools you're using. Like I initially started allowing the use of AI under certain conditions for my students' assessments that they do at home. I also do things in class, but the things they do at home, I allow it. And one reason is that, like, I went on to Copilot and I put my own, papers type and topic in, and it told me about a paper I didn't know about yet. And I was like, oh, I just learned something in 2 minutes.
Was it real?
Yeah.
Is it a real paper?
Yeah, and it was great. It was really good. So I feel like I was approaching it in curiosity, and my curiosity was rewarded. But obviously, if you're approaching it as in, how do I save time? Maybe you're rewarded with saving time. And so I don't know if maybe it's partly, and that speaks to Nick's presentation today of like whether it's labor that you're alienated from or labor that you're carrying out for your own reasons.
So in critical thinking, there's certain fallacies, certain biases that we have. One of them comes up in Tom Gilrich's book, How We Know What Isn't So. And I know with sports, you're not that familiar, Jenith, but this is because we know one another, right? But there's, a regression to the mean in some cases. There's something called the Sports Illustrated jinx. And a lot of people have it where an athlete will be featured on Sports Illustrated because they had a really great performance. But then they're like, oh no, I never want to be on this cover because, next year I'm not going to do as well and this gives me a jinx. It's like I'm cursed. But this is a regression to the mean, right? You're not going to have that superior performance all the time. And indeed, AI systems can help us with this because they're good with statistics in that way, right? And they won't have the same sort of, like you and I, we see patterns and things that don't naturally display them, right? We're pareidolia beings. We see animal shapes in the clouds or in the constellations and the stars, and in our alphabet soup, there's messages, right? But I think AI can actually help correct some of these things with pattern detection. And maybe it can provide that corrective that we need. Now, it also suffers from all sorts of other shit that we know, right? And so we've got to be very careful with that too. But I think like with critical thinking, these are real tools that can help us.
Any other questions? Patrick?
I've got a two-part question. The first one is a digital have and have not. So there's going to be a lot of people that are using AI, but there's going to be people in different parts of the community that don't. What are your thoughts on maybe providing the chatbot, a digital assistant, whatever, as part of the new, which is the second part of the question, is part of the new AI era law?
So I think the thing that comes to my mind is I don't think we're even there yet because not everybody has access to quality internet access in this province. So actually I think that's where we need to start, because when you look at the internet now, it's pretty much just as essential in many ways as water, as housing, and that's a different challenges, and there's some challenges there. So I think that's where I start with that. I think there's some work being done around, in education, for example. There are many school boards provide a kid with a Chromebook, right? So, because you need to have access to the tools and the things in order to be able to use it. So maybe in 5 or 10 years, we're probably there, but I think there's some more basic things that we need to sort first. But again, I think that's why it's so important that A, we're having these conversations, and B, that we have everyone around the table.
Any more questions?
The issue comes up actually in school systems now too, right? Where there's this considerations about equity and equal access. Because as we know, especially with chatbot use, people can have premium accounts, right? That do all sorts of other things, have all the sort of features and can outperform, others. So that draws on the same sort of issue. Very good.
So a question over here?
Yeah, I want to go to the themes that we started to talking about. Having this be a collaborative effort with different groups of people, whether it's demographic, whether it's experts, things of the sort. There's often this rhetoric of technology and techno acceleration is a bill that will fix it later. And currently, just as a third part to my question, we were also in the federal minority government path. Now, we were talking about regulation. I'm not sure if I turn into a majority. Sorry to remind you, I'm provincial, so when we talk about regulation, is regulation enough, or is this something where we get to talk about this like the SEC, DOT, things that are independent, that can be nimble, act quickly, and we can still have that public trust where, I don't need to vote on AI every single day, but I still want to have say in this, and I think we all do, where they can act autonomous, but also we can still be involved in this. Is this going to be efficient, or will this be too bureaucratic with the funding considerations? I'm just curious.
You're considering regulatory?
Having bodies specifically, not necessarily just act.
Like a certification type thing?
I'm not too familiar with forms of government, but I'm under the
We barely regulate the internet.
But you can think of this like car emissions.
Yeah, car emissions, like the EPA with car emissions. That means delegate this responsibility.
Some tracking of pollution. Yeah, no, I think this is a good, what are your own thoughts on this?
I don't know if it'd be effective or not having these bodies, but I mean, at least there's I don't know, certain discussions of bodies not being effective once they're made, and how to balance this autonomy of having them be effective but not having too much control and being authoritarian. But I'm just thinking of ways to act even in terms of AI, because it's so fast acting.
Yeah.
So I think this kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, right? Like we both want to move quickly, right? In the sense that it seems like, things are kind of barreling out of control and we want to get ahead of things. But at the same time, you don't want to move too quickly because there might be little ways in which we might realize, you can't actually improve things. And so we can't be too quick about these things, or we might overregulate, or we might overcompensate. But
I would agree. I mean, I think in general, there needs to be some sort of a broader framework around this, and maybe there are kind of some lines or guardrails, but I look at this as well from an economic perspective, where I don't want to stifle innovation and the ability to find the next breakthrough or do the next thing. So it's a hard thing to figure out. And like, I think to my point, are we really regulating the internet that much? I don't even know, right? Quite frankly. Like I was just explaining earlier, when somebody dies, an obituary goes up and there's these websites that scrape it and then bring it to different web pages and then fundraise off of it, which is disgusting. And I looked into it, there's like almost nothing we can do about it. So it's a good question. I don't know. I think there's some things that we got to do now to get the public and population up. That's right. Because guess what? We can make rules here, but we're a country of 35 million, 40 million. Where are we at now? Like, okay, we're a small player in the world, right? So if we stick our head in the sand, we are going to fall further behind, which is also my concern.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you mentioned kind of like stifling innovation, which I understand from a certain perspective if you do certain types of regulation, but on a certain level, I believe that regulation also breeds innovation, because when you limit, every type of innovation comes from limiting yourself, right, in some way. And so if you do have an independent agency that can make strategic throwing a wrench into kind of the drive of current AI systems, because if you look at like OpenAI, for example, their full strategy was just to scale, and it was more and more money, more and more resources just to scale. And that was a strategy. Is it an innovative strategy? Probably not, right? And so then you have, DeepSeek comes along, they find more efficient ways to train their models with those regulations in place and limited resources. So I guess that's where my concern.
I guess my question though, then, does the market not correct for that? Like we saw the dot-com, we saw the bubble, right? The market will correct for some of those things. I think the biggest nature of our conversation today around the ethical aspects of some of these things definitely probably require some sort of regulation. It's just writ large of the sector. If I put my Canada hat on, and let's say we really do that, we fall much further behind. I always have to say it's the United States in some ways, just based on our context of where we are. That would have to play a bigger role when it comes to it.
I'll agree with that.
In fairness, right?
So with that, we are out of questions. So I want to thank our panelists again for being here.